increases if I don't do it early.
Dan, do you want me to go ahead and share my screen with the PowerPoint?
Yes, please.
Will do.
I do want to give people maybe 2 minutes to get logged in. I know I had to jump from one meeting to another, and so there were a lot of open questions around how EdFi security is structured and what it actually looks like. And it's not something that I could effectively explain. So I reached out to Education Analytics for them to do a presentation on it. And they agreed to run it through it with us. So Rosh, I don't know how to say your last name well, so I'm not going to murder it. It will be presenting today on the EdFi security model. Rosh, how do I say your last name?
So the easiest way is to remember it as like 3 distinct words: the, now, and day. If you put it together, it's the now day.
The now day. All
Yep,
right,
there you go.
And I'm going to go silent now and let Rosh get started.
All right, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining and giving us the opportunity to go through some of these details here. The slide deck that I have up and I'll be going through gets fairly granular and fairly in the weeds. So if at any point I'm moving into territory where anybody on the call feels like, okay, this is more detailed than we need, you can always feel free to pull me back. One of the things that I did want to mention is that I'm fairly new to EA, so I've only been here a month and a half, but I spent the last 5 years in Indiana building and being the primary technical architect for collaboratives similar to the DDGG. And so we have about 30 districts, just over 300,000 students in our system, and I architected that system from the ground up. It's an on-prem deployment. And so I'm familiar with EdFi patterns on-prem and then in the cloud as well. And so I'm hoping to share some of my knowledge in regards to EdFi patterns writ large, and then also specifically for the deployment that's in South Carolina. At any point, people can interrupt and ask questions, and I'll be happy to answer any asides that come up. Andrew or Dan, any other context before I get into the context?
Do you want us to monitor the chat, Rosh, or do you want to just take the questions verbally?
Whatever your norms are, I don't mind either way.
Then I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Sounds good. Okay, let's jump into it then. So just as a quick agenda, we're just going to go over the EdFi deployment in South Carolina currently. Then I'll go through an explanation of what claim sets are, what authorization strategies are, then ending with keys and secrets, go over what the admin app does, and then what are the current security procedures in place for anything that wasn't covered by those other agenda items. So in South Carolina, the current deployment is currently fully in AWS. So there are no on-prem components of the stack. So everything is fully within Amazon Web Services parameters and has all the tooling and affordances that come with a cloud environment. We are currently deploying the ODS and the API in a container-based deployment. These are not traditional deployments where there are individual VMs that host the ODS and the API. Like in my previous job, where we had a separate server that had the API, a separate server that had the database server, and those communicated using protocols like either the IIS app pool. That is not present here in this deployment. These are all container-based deployments of all of these individual components. The ODS databases themselves live in an Aurora Postgres cluster that I'll highlight on the next. Sorry, was that a question or just the echo? Okay. In addition to the container-based deployment, there's also the actual SQL backend for this is not Microsoft SQL, but it is PostgreSQL. That allows for us to have the same level of quality on the ODSs, but at a fraction of the price compared to licensing Microsoft SQL Server. I'm very familiar with that. In my previous iteration, my previous job, we were a Microsoft shop all the way around. The only way that we were able to stay affordable is because we leveraged the purchasing power of the university within which our collaborative was housed. Elastic Beanstalk is used for expanding and contracting the environment based on demand that's coming in. So as we're fielding in multiple API requests from all the districts that are currently active in South Carolina, we allow AWS's tooling to expand and contract the environment based on the actual demand that's coming in. Then the Edfi admin app is installed and active, but it is only used for a really narrow slice of what we do in South Carolina. And then one of the core components that sets South Carolina apart from most other deployments is that there's also the Edfi API publisher, which pulls data from the district ODSs and then pushes it up to a state-based ODS that is the commingling of all of those districts. And so we have that publisher tool that is entirely running within the stack. There's no UI for it. It's very much like a bare bones tooling to just move data from one ODS to the other using the API exclusively. So still retaining everything that I'm going to talk about in terms of security practices. All of that is applied to that data copy as well. There's no manual movement of data from one Postgres database to another. It's all being facilitated through secure API transfer. So just as a visual for what we have running here is that each one of these little colored boxes represents its own kind of kingdom and own domain with a certain level of access inbound and outbound. And so as data comes in, so as we were talking through things, one of the things that I want to point out is that this is not the Edfi admin app. This is an Edfi admin persona. So this is a select group of people. Currently, it's just 2 staff members on my team here, Mark, Tenhur, and Ashara, that have access at this level. If they want to go in, they have to go in through a particular set of patterns that are governed by each of these individual sections. So when they come in, there is a set of security groups and rules that govern who can even enter the environment. And then depending on if they want to access admin app, they have to be in a particular security group to even get to admin app. There's a particular username and password to log into admin app as well. And then in order for admin app to communicate with any of the databases that are in the Aurora cluster, there are another set of rules that need to be traversed in order to access that system. So in essence, the equivalent for this is it's not an exact firewall appliance, but it's the AWS equivalent of what a firewall would be, which is security groups, which govern transactions between all of these different machines and environments. They each have a very tightly, rigorously controlled set of who can transact into and outbound in terms of HTTPS traffic, and then also who can enter into these environments in order to interface with the containers or with Beanstalk or any of the CloudFormation templates. Up above, this line above is really what all the districts are interacting with. So your PowerSchool instance has a key and secret. It has a connection that gets open between PowerSchool and between the environment in which the ODSs are deployed. That traffic hits the load balancer on the AWS side. The only traffic that's allowed inbound is narrowly scoped to a set of security rules on the load balancer. Then once the load balancer decides, oh, okay, we've segmented off District 1 from District 2, we're going to individually let them both have the similar quality of service, but we're going to route them now into the auto-scaling group where all of these Docker containers live. There's a separate set of rules that then govern, okay, what traffic from the load balancer can even land in this area. And then once it lands in this area, it then goes through the normal API interactions to say, okay, this key and secret has now come inbound. It's wanting to put some student assignment data or student section data into the ODS. The API receives that. It translates that into a series of SQL writes or deletes or a different set of CRUD. And then that has to traverse using TLS and HTTPS into the Postgres instance, which also has its own set of rules. So as you can see here in a cloud deployment, you have like extreme segmentation and separation between all of these various components so that we can be hyper controlled about who has access to actual student data. You have to traverse through many layers in order to get to actual student data. And currently, the only things that you can do to access student data is through a key and secret that's been securely distributed to a district, or for an Edfi admin, which is currently just 2 people that are in a particular AWS security group that can access on this bottom row here into the databases. And that is just on a need to know only when necessary or directed by SCD or a district in order to do that, just for administrative purposes. Any questions before I move into the more nitty gritty claim set authorization rules? Any questions about this environment over here? I'm going to revisit the slide at the very end to kind of coalesce all the topics that we're going to talk about throughout the meeting today.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. But so you mentioned that the gateway and the ODS were on the same container I'm assuming on the same server?
No, so the ODS, so the actual databases are in a separate Postgres Aurora cluster. And then the Docker containers that have the API, which interfaces with the actual ODSs, those are containerized here in this Docker square over here.
Okay. So those are done on more of an external basis and the with like a WAF or something, and then you have the router, and then in the inside you have the databases. Sorry, the way you phrased it in the first slide, I thought you said they were on the same server for a minute.
No, sorry. If I said that, then I've misspoken. But the API is one component of the ODS API, right? And they're both containerized. The API component is in this square over here. The ODS component is in this square over here. They can essentially only talk to each other using TLS protocol, which is the API talking with the databases, instantiating that connection using particular credentials that are in the secrets manager up here. But yeah, those are 2 separate things. It's all AWS magic on how that happens internally. Like we don't have to manually manage the actual appliances or routers or how this data gets transferred. That is part of leveraging like economies of scale at AWS to allow this to happen, governed using security rules, but also knowing that that is handled in the secure methodology that AWS advertises and has published publicly for us to be able to access and read through what those specs are.
Yeah, no, the only thing that was confusing was that you're talking about the containers and they were different than your previous deployment. That's what threw me. But
yeah. So in my previous deployment, like all of these things, like these are all actual machines that I had to configure, and then had to open up, firewall exceptions between each or put them on internal IPs. None of that is necessary in a cloud deployment like this.
Okay.
I mean, I say that it's not necessary, but technically you could do a traditional VM deployment in the cloud. Like you could just replicate an on-prem deployment. That's not the models that have been put into place for South Carolina's EDFI implementation.
Sure.
It's definitely a lot less headache to maintain on a day-to-day basis. That's for sure.
Well, and as we've talked to other, we don't have to get into this. And as we've talked to other, there's a few states that have tried to do that and sort of use a VM kind of strategy, and the cost is shocking, actually, how much they're spending on that. So this is both, we think, very secure, probably more secure than that, but also a lot cheaper.
All right, so now the really exciting content. So buckle up. So there are a number of different components to EDFI security. And so we'll break them up into 2 major categories. The first category is going to be authorization. So what can you do and who can do what? Less so authentication, which we'll get to later on. Authentication is fairly straightforward, but authorization is where things get a little bit muddy and a little bit obtuse sometimes if you're just looking at the public EDFI documentation. So what claim sets are at the very baseline, they're just rules that govern access to particular resources, data elements, and then the access is governed by certain set of actions, which is create, read, update, and delete. So your standard database interactions, or CRUD. And so the claim sets marry together what resources can be interacted with in what way, and in what way is the actions that are in these CRUD actions listed over here. So claims aren't transmitted or issued between parties. There's no movement of claims. So there is a similar thing called claims and like claims-based authentication, but this is not that. This is just saying claim sets are a set of rules that Edfi has in place that govern what resources can be acted on in what way, and that is then tied up in a title called a claim set. Claims aren't issued by the Edfi security database and the caller's access token, so none of that is instantiated. So this is literally just a static set of rules that never gets passed back and forth. It just exists in the security database, and then it's evaluated when the authentication step comes in, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The resource claims are cached locally in each Edfi ODS API host process until the token expires. So when we start talking about the authentication, I'll highlight when that claim set comes into play, what it actually governs, and then when it is disposed of. And this all happens machine to machine, right? So there's no human interaction with the claim sets. This all happens in the HTTPS interactions between the machines that are talking on the API layer, and these claim sets only get instantiated to negotiate the access for that key and secret, and then get kind of disposed of. So here's a picture of what claim sets kind of look like if we had to take a database diagram approach to look at it. So if we had a claim set that said, this claim set has access to education organizations, and it can do all of these actions here. What that also means by extension is that there are related elements or related resources to education organization that claim set essentially federates you or gives you equal privilege to those child records here. So if you if you configure a claim set that has full CRUD on education organizations, that means it also has full CRUD on these child records over here. What you can also do by extension is you could say, well, we want a claim set that only has access to local education agency. And so then it would only have record access to local education agency and then the child records of local education agency. And within a claim set, you can even further do two things. You can say this claim set can only read, it can only update, it can only delete, or it can only read, or it can only create. The claim set allows you to have that level of flexibility to say that there is a set of rules that say you can only do this. So a good example of that is there exists a BI vendor claim set that is publicly available. It's been defined by the community and then is now part of what people can share for these open claim sets. So we have a BI claim set in Indiana where that claim set allows a BI vendor to read only, but not to create, update, or delete, because that BI vendor is only going to pull information and put into a dashboard. And we don't want them to be able to create or update or delete any records. We literally just want them to read. And so that claim set just says read on education organization plus all of these other resources that are available in Edfi and nothing else. Whereas if you compare that with the SIS vendor claim set, the SIS vendor claim set has all of these actions on essentially every resource in Edfi, because you are allowing the SIS to populate a multitude of resources and a multitude of domains simultaneously. And the claim set says that here's the permissions that the SIS has to do that, encapsulated in this claim set. So that's a very obtuse and very ephemeral. So any questions about claim sets before we move on to the second part of this? If you're reading the word here that says no further authorization required, that's the second component of claim set, which is authorization strategies. So before I move on to that one, I just want to make sure that everybody is clear about claim sets being exclusively a set of rules that govern interactions with resources. And it's just authorization. It's not authentication. Okay, so the second part of this becomes a second layer of authorization that you would give to a claim set, is to say, hey, I'm even more narrowly scoping what you can do with this claim set. And there are kind of three basic patterns that authorization strategies fall into. One is no further authorization. That means if this claim set is configured with this particular authorization strategy, then you have full access to everything that is within that claim set. You're not restricted to anything except the education organization. I'll get to that in a second, but you're not restricted to any particular domain. You can read, you can write, you can do with any namespace that exists in this ODS currently, or you can create a new namespace in that ODS. The second is namespace-based filtering. So namespace-based says you have full CRUD, but only on the things that are within this particular namespace. And a namespace exists in the ODS on many tables in order to introduce segmentation of data. The best example of namespace-based authorization is when you are interfacing with an assessment vendor. So let's say NWEA, you want to load map data into the ODS. You don't want the key and secret that you are creating for NWEA to have access to create student enrollment records. You want the NWEA claim set or the assessment vendor claim set to only be able to have full CRUD on things that are created and put into place by the NWEA vendor API key and secret. You don't want it to do anything else. So when you come in and now that claim set is tied to that key and secret, that claim set says NWEA can only have full CRUD, but only in the places in the ODS that have a namespace, and only the namespace that is attached to that key and secret, nothing else. So it's even a further segmentation of the rules that we talked about before. You're essentially authorizing this particular claim set to only address a particular set of namespaces. And you don't specify the namespace, you just say that this claim set is namespace based. There's a second portion in the authentication side that we'll talk about that connects a namespace with a key and secret, with a claim set, with an education organization, and all those components together formulate access. But authorization strategies by itself is just like one abstract component that says this particular claim set also has individual rights to various resources within this particular scope. And that scope is either no further authorization or namespace based, or the third one, which is relationship based strategies, which gets a little bit confusing because you can say that this claim set can have full read on every education organization, but it only has create, update, and delete on a particular local education agency, or vice versa. But this is a very granular authorization strategy that I've never really seen in play in the field, and it's not part of the EA and South Carolina partnership right now. The only two authorization strategies that are in play are no further authorization, because there's sys vendor claim set that's in play, and that requires access to all of the resources. And then namespace will come into play when, as South Carolina and DDDG start working with more and more assessment vendors, those vendors will have claim sets that have the namespace based authorization strategy. So here are two examples, and I think I've already gone over this. So the first example is the SIS can be authorized to read and write against students and staff data associated with an LEA that they serve. And so that's no further authorization required. The only authorization is the education organization that's been tied to the key and secret that is referencing that claim set. The second one is, like I already talked about with NWEA, is that that particular claim set can only transact with the things that are in the namespace that are tied with the key and secret. So those are the two instantiation of authorization strategies. If you want to do more reading, here's all the various flavors of the relationship-based authorization. If there is a business need in the future for us to do even narrower scoping of these claim sets, because there exists maybe a particular vendor that only manages parent and student data, we could create a claim set that only allows that vendor to only be able to have full CRUD on a particular set of relationships. But we haven't gotten far enough in this project to get to that granularity of access, but there does exist the ability in the EdFi authorization claim set strategies where you can create that level of like granular access and granular control of who can interact with the ODS. So that exists there. I'll let you read this on your own time. I did add a reference slide at the very end if you want to read the actual tech docs that go into this. But at this point in time, the only two that are currently active in South Carolina are the no further authorizations and the namespace-based authorization strategies. So how do all of these things work together? Well, currently, if you look in the EdFi security database, the EdFi security database instantiates the connection between these two different areas. So at the top here, you'll see the claim sets. And so this has your sys vendor claim set, your district hosted sys vendor. You have a set of standard claim sets that have been defined along with like the API publisher claim set. Those all live in here. Those are just bundling of rules, right? And so if we follow this arrow over here, there is a set of claims that are associated with that claim set. So here are the resources down here. Here's what those resources can do. And the only application that's currently authorized to even interact with the claim sets is the EdFi API application. So in the EdFi security database, you don't even get to what systems can and cannot interact with the API. That's in a separate database that we'll get to in a second. So if we're just looking at authorization and just looking at EdFi security database, it literally just has the set of rules that govern the road. It doesn't have anything about who can actually be on that road. It just maps out who can go to what resources and whose gates are open and closed to those resources based on the claim set resource name, and authorization strategy combinations. And then those actions here, those CRUD actions are defined down here, and those are tied in this claim set resource claims is where all these three things come together. The claim set, the action, and the authorization strategy then get stored and then get referred to by a claim set name or a claim set ID. So at any given time, you can look in the open source EdFi security code repository, and you could see like the basic set of claim sets that exist if you just did a default installation. And those are open to anybody because those are community driven claim sets that the community starts to build up and say, here are all these various flavors of authorizations that we want people to have, or here are all these different flavors of people want to see this but don't want to see that. And here are what vendors are asking for, and we're kind of tightly scoping what people can do based on these various claim sets that are publicly negotiated. So that's all the authorization side of the house, and that's claim sets together with authorization strategies, and those claim sets are tied to actions. So I'll pause for a second for any questions. I can pop up the chat if there are any questions in there too before we move on to like the second half of the puzzle, which is the instantiation of these things in the authentication framework that's in EdFi.
There's nothing in the chat, Rosh. But if you want to take a breath, I certainly understand.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so claim sets, one side of the house, authorization strategies, a sister concept with claim sets that exist in EdFi security. So that's one pillar of your EdFi security model. The second pillar is the EdFi admin database, and that's where keys and secrets come into play. So the only way for anybody to interact with the ODS is either through that bottom row of interaction where it's an actual administrator logging into the cluster to look at it in AWS, going through all the AWS groups, or in the top section only through API, right? So that's the framework that's been laid in South Carolina, that people can only interact with the ODS through the API. And so how that works is that EdFi has implemented a two-legged OAuth 2 model, which means that there is a first request that gets sent in using the key and secret to retrieve a token. Then that token is used to federate access to the resources. And all of those are all handled over HTTPS, all through TLS. And so those are all encrypted communication back and forth between the source system and the API, the Dockerized API. Those are all encrypted. There's no human interaction or transference of any credentials. That's all being handled by OAuth 2 and the authentication that's been put into place by EdFi as a default. So this is a kind of a picture and an image of what happens. So here's your SIS. You put in the key and secret that's been distributed to you. PowerSchool then sends that key and secret into the API token endpoint. the API says, oh, I'm going to accept that key and secret because that key and secret exists in the Edfi admin database. And now that I see that it's in the admin database, I'm going to furnish you a token that contains all the claim sets and the authorization strategy that we talked about before. Because in that Edfi admin database is a connection between three major components. The first component is a key and secret pair. The second component is the education organization, which is very important because you can only create a key and secret that is scoped for a particular education organization. And in the case of South Carolina, the education organization is the district ID. So there's a unique pairing between key and secret, district ID, and then finally the third part is the claim set that governs what that key and secret is allowed to do once that key and secret has been authenticated and tied to a particular education organization. And that's all contained in this data access token that gets returned by OAuth. Now with that data access token, the SIS has a particular window of time. So that token expires after, I don't remember the exact values for when the OAuth 2 tokens expire, but it's the standard OAuth 2 token expiry. So PowerSchool retrieves that token, starts sending messages through the API responds to it. It says, hey, if you try to send me something or you attempt to do an action that's not contained within this claim set, I'm going to tell you you're not able to do that. I'm going to give you a 403 error. I'm going to give you a 404 error, or I'm going to give you a 500 error because that key and secret that you tried to use is not in the Edfi admin database. So there's a lot of barriers before that key and secret can even do things because the API first evaluates that key and secret to retrieve the token. Then that token has a set of authorizations that token is allowed to do. And if you attempt to do something with that token that's outside the bounds of what's defined in the claim sets and the authorization strategies, the API is going to return responses to that regard. It's going to say, hey, you can't do these things. Even though I've accepted your key and secret, you're not allowed to read this namespace, or you're not allowed to write to this, or you're not allowed to delete this resource. That's all enumerated in the claim sets that we just talked about. And this happens, even if you're looking at PowerSchool and you're pressing the publish buttons, what happens is that you are, to your eyes, you're just seeing that it's just happening, right? The publishing column is going and things are going back and forth. But what's happening is that every time the token expires, PowerSchool has to take a pause, re-authenticate, retrieve a new token, go on, wait till that token expires, reissue. So not only does that key and secret carry weight, there's also this access token that continually verifies whether or not that key and secret can even access the ODS through the API, right? So there's this constant evaluation of security. And if there is any issue with the key and secret, as soon as you invalidate that key and secret, all tokens also get invalidated, right? So even if there were a reason to change keys and secrets, as soon as you change key and secrets, all the active tokens expire, and immediately the API starts returning 500 errors if somebody is trying to use that previous key and secret. So there's always a constant evaluation of security in this kind of back and forth interaction between the source system and the API using that key and secret.
Just curious, does
Yep.
it ever expire if you use it too many times, like a password?
So as long as the first layer, so this first leg, if the key and secret are correct and it exists in the admin database, it will return that token back to you. Now,
Right.
if you try to authenticate either using an invalid key secret pair, you'll just get like denied at this point right here, right? But it won't time you out or anything like that. It will just it'll just keep responding to you like, hey, you're not allowed to access this. So it just keeps the door closed. It doesn't even give you a peek that either or part of this pair is valid. It just says, hey, this whole pair is invalid. I'm not even gonna dignify your pinging with a response. I'm just gonna say, hey, 500, we don't exist to you because you're not giving us a valid pair of credentials.
Right, but it tells me that the brute force attack I'm instantiating is invalid key and secret. So I guess my question is, does it ever time out? Like if I tried to log into my bank 3 times incorrectly, it's going to lock out the key, my password and username. Does it do that?
No, not really, because the way that OAuth 2 is designed is that you can't really put that in place because you never know when somebody is going to hit that API endpoint with a valid secret, right? So if it does shut down, then we would have like global rules like that in place and would hamper the ability for somebody with a valid key and secret to authenticate in. That's a
Network
valid thing
doing-
to think about too, though, because
Yeah,
I need to think through when I used to negotiate my API logs, how many times I would get like invalid things and kind of clog up my traffic. That's certainly
yeah.
something to consider,
Well,
to bring
just
up.
from even if it was a network solution, it would be good. Meaning, your firewall detected it somehow.
Oh yeah, yeah. So that's part of like, if it was just like brute force incoming traffic, that's what, if we go back a few slides to the load balancer would see like, hey, you're getting a brute force attack from this particular range of IPs. The load balancer would then say, okay, hey, we're gonna flag that,
Okay, good.
and I'm not gonna let that traffic come through.
All right, good.
Yep, yeah. So there's a couple of different layers there, but just on
Yeah.
this part over here, it would be a little bit difficult to control. But you're exactly right. There are other methods to blunt that type of attack that are in place in the current stack.
Okay, good. That's all I was worried about.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Okay, so how do keys and secrets get created, right? That's part of why we're having this conversation today. So the creation of a key and secret can be done in two ways. Very recently, like just in the past 2-3 years, the EdFi Alliance has released a tool called the Admin app, and the Admin app allows you to have a user interface to log into to create keys and secrets. Though to do that on the scale of South Carolina is like entirely ridiculous, because to even log in just for 86, 87 districts to create a key and secret, it's just going to take a lot of time and effort to do that within the admin app. The admin app is really designed for individual district implementations or small collaboratives, not a giant state scale in terms of the initial creation of keys and secrets. So the method that was used to distribute the keys and secrets for South Carolina districts was running a script on the EdFi admin database to create a whole list of keys and secrets that tie in the three components that I mentioned: the education organization, the creation of the key and secret, and then the claim set that is tied to that key and secret and ed.org pair, right? So just to kind of break it down a little bit further, is that there are multiple components. So the third component here, so you have the authorization, you have the authentication with OAuth2, and then you have the third pedestal, which is the ed.org ID. And in your case, it's your district ID. So the connection with a key and secret is only valuable if you have the education organization tied to it on the administration app. On the EdFi admin database. Those three things together say that a particular key and secret can only see data for that particular district and only have this level of readability, accessibility, deletion capability that's defined in this claim set. So the keys and secrets that are in place right now only allow a particular district to see their own data, interface with their own data. There is no cross-district ability to use one district's key and secret unless you went into the EdFi admin database and swapped that out. And currently that's only scoped to 2 people to be able to do even that task. And even then, the results of that would be that the district whose ed.org ID was changed would now see, like we said, their token rejected, right? And as soon as that happened, they would start seeing errors in their PowerSchool instance saying that their key and secret is invalid. So that education organization component is very important here, because there doesn't exist an ability in the EdFi security model to give you one key and secret that has master access to every education organization that's in your cluster. It is only a strict pairing between key and secret and that particular education organization. So these pairs grant a specific organization, in this case districts, the ability to perform certain actions, and that's the connection between claim set and key and secret that is then instantiated in the EdFi admin database. Oh, do I have two of the same slides? I don't know what it's doing there. So then storage and administration. So these key and secret pairs are in the EdFi admin database. Again, that is only accessible to 2 admins currently. the full list of keys and secrets that exist right now and that are active and that would return a valid token are listed in that admin database. The pairs have an identity column that provides a data point to see in what order those pairs and that pairing was created. The admin database access is narrowly scoped to advice staff, like I've already mentioned. So if we were to use admin app to create a key and secret, that secret is only visible at creation time. So you would go into admin app, click on create a secret. It flashes up and says, hey, write this down or note this down. Here's a key, here's a secret, here's the namespace that is tied to. Note it down, because as soon as you click OK, you'll never be able to see that from the admin app again. The only way to see that key and secret again is to regenerate it, which means that it would wipe out the old pair, it would delete that entry in the admin app, and then instantiate a new entry in the database further down in the identity insert that says, hey, here's a new key and secret that was created for this combination. And so that identity column allows us to see like what kind of transactions happened there. It doesn't give us full visibility. It's not a complete log, but it's evidence of keys and secrets have been created out of order. And it gives us an inclination of if there's an issue. And as we've reviewed it, we haven't seen any break in that pattern. We did have Lexington 1, I believe, yesterday request a new key and secret from us. And so that was the first instance of where there's an out of order identity that appears, because now Lexington's key and secret is now further down on the list compared to when it was originally instantiated. Again, the admin app does not display the secret. And then once you tie those together, that is when these components that we've all talked about, the claim sets, the authorization strategies, the education organization, all of those get commingled in a table in the admin database called the API clients table. And you can see the connection between all of those units there at any given time. The authorization scope, so the claim set is visible in the admin app if you were able to log in, but that only gives you only one leg of the security stool, right? You can only see what you could do with that key and secret. It doesn't enable you to act on that because you are missing the kind of key component, which is the secret, to be able to do that work with.
Question.
So the admin app was created to assist with management of the ODS API currently in South
Raj?
Carolina. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Heard a question.
Real quick question. So which, and you may not know this, but which profile has the ability to authenticate the API call with a key and secret? Is it the username? Is it the admin app username and password? Or is it the API? Or is it something different for each instance?
Let me go to the picture here that we had earlier, and then if you could tell me like which part of the chain that you're asking a question about, then I can answer that better.
Yeah. So I'm the part of the chain is I'm coming in as an admin user, and I'm authenticating, and or even just as the PowerSchool, I'm pushing the button on the PowerSchool side to ship you data, right?
Yep.
Let's do that.
So up here.
And then
Yep.
when I ship you my key and secret, who is able to verify what piece of the pie is verifying the username and password? Is it the same username and password as the admin app that connects the database to the admin app, or is it the API gateway?
Right. So what happens is that comes in here, and then there is a particular admin user that is obscure to even us. It's a key and secret that's been put into Secrets Manager.
Good.
That is separate from this username and password here. This only exists separately from here. So when this pulls in the credentials, what it does is it says, hey, this key and secret,
that works. That's what I was curious about is now that you've explained how it's created, is who's actually going to decrypt it and see it to verify it. And you're saying it's the third party that nobody's really authenticating into, essentially.
Yeah, it's not even a party. It's just like machines talking to each other, right? It's
perfectly fine to me. That's the way it needs to be. It needs to be bifurcated there. Perfect.
Right. Yeah. So all of these lines here are all machines talking to each other and instantiating these like obscure secrets, even from my team, right? Like once once it's instantiated by secrets manager, we don't touch that at all. It just gets negotiated in here. The admin app login, the username and password to log into admin app was a one-time creation when admin app was first installed. And then there's not even the ability to create another user. That admin app username and password is in, I believe it's in like Mark's password manager that's secured by like all of our SOC 2 policies at EA. So that's completely separate from this pathway up here that governs the PowerSchool interaction with data. And even if you had this admin app password, you would have to breach like that password manager and that like
No, I'm not worried
256.
about that.
Gotcha.
I was more worried about the admin app's exposure during the development phase prior to the firewalls existing, and the username and password of the application itself to the database having access or having been seen.
Yeah, so there's even more layers to that, right? So this admin app can only interface with this over here, and it particularly only interfaces with the Edfi admin database, and that has its own key and secret as well. So
Right.
there's a key and secret that gets negotiated in here between the admin app to admin to even talk to each other and to even talk to the ODSs. There's like and that all is done through TLS. So there's not even a username and password that is federating this access here. The only username and password is this inbound to get to the surface of the admin app. And that is limited to just Mark right now.
Yeah, no, the user side, I'm less worried about. I'm actually more worried about the web application talking to the admin database itself.
That's all, machines, and that's it.
Perfect.
Yeah. I mean, it's a huge it's a huge surface layer that is eliminated, that is present like in my Indiana deployment that's still active right now. Like this is all like, humans not manually pushing things over to each other, but it's like, IIS talking and passing the integrated user and the app pool identity, like all of those things like we have to manually keep track of. But the nice thing about cloud deployment and modern architecture is that you can like offload the thinking of that and say, hey, this is much more secure at managing these things than I as a human am, and I'm going to farm that all out to them, right? So as threats evolve and as new algorithms come into place, those can then all get implemented there. It's not reliant on me as a human to actually implement that. I mean, it's a huge load off to.
Yeah, the secrets manager is a big piece there.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions before let's see. Yeah, I think I have one more slide. I'll talk about admin app more and what functionality that affords. But any other questions before I move on? Okay, so in South Carolina, there's that single admin app installation. Previously, it was available to log in just on the internet, but again, you needed to have that username and password. And then recently, we've moved that behind to only it's behind like another one of those colored boxes. So only particular IPs from EA's internal network can even access that currently. There's no additional users in the admin database. We checked that. There's just the initial EA employee, and those admin app credentials don't get stored in like a local file or anything. It's just all in programmatic storage. So admin app is a nice tool, but for this kind of enterprise deployment of this scale, it's really not the tool that we would regularly interface in to manage the keys and secrets. We would do that behind the scenes. So last night when the request came in for a new key and secret, Mark went in using his administrator password, changed the key and secret, shared that out with Lexington securely. We didn't go through admin app because there would be multiple steps there that don't increase security, that don't increase any value. It's just an alternate pathway to get there, but it's much quicker for us to turn around time and just as secure for us to manually create those. Yeah, I think we've already covered all of these as well. And so as we've talked about, like all of these various components get instantiated all through machine communication. It keeps the human component out of it. It reduces the threat level just a little bit. We are, as we are continuing to think about this and improving the monitoring and logging of all of these systems, there's a lot of room for us to add more functionality, and that's part of my mandate coming in and taking on this role, is to work with the cloud engineering team and to resource allocate so that we can be more robust in all of these areas, like add increased logging, add some more kind of machine learning based examination of those logs, and looking at event logging, and like there's a bunch of things that we can add in here. But even what we currently have in place is much more secure than a normal traditional on-prem deployment, because so much of the communication between the services and the entities that are part of this are completely obscured from human eyes and are all handled by machines. And we're heavily leveraging that to make sure that district data is secure, the data that's moving to South Carolina to the state ODS is secure, and everything in between, right? All of that is negotiated completely through secured protocols. And so we're happy to answer any further questions there are. I'll leave this slide up instead of going to a generic question slide, but happy to answer any questions that you all still have lingering, or go to one of the components that we've talked about and go into it more in detail as well.
I'd add to that too. This is Andrew. If you're like, oh, cool, but I wish we could do X, Y, and Z, that's really great feedback, both for us, but also for the EdFi community as a whole. I was just on a meeting in the prior hour where different states were talking about different things that they were doing, and I was like, I don't know if that makes sense or not. And so I'd love to know more, like what you're all are thinking about that kind of stuff.
The data governance group tasked me with doing a use case on how the admin app, or maybe something else based on some of the detail, some other type of UI interface for the districts to manage claim sets, and probably a closer alignment to their contract management, vendor management systems. So I'll be working on that. I think my only questions, just for clarity, were more of a breach case analysis if there was a breach. If that's okay now or not, I don't know, because I don't want to take away from anybody else.
Well, Jeff, on that admin app thing, I think there's a couple interesting things going on, and then one is I just learned that Wisconsin built their own thing to do kind of what you're talking about, and we've heard, I think Roche in Indiana has used a certain one that Michigan has used. I do think that there's a need in the community for someone to develop a more like this kind of level of scale type of administration and contract management application. It would be a huge value for the whole field. I think Texas needs this. So it's a huge value for you all to have input on that, both in South Carolina, but also across the country. So I appreciate that.
Yep. My only last question has to do with breach case in terms of what would happen, just from understanding roles between the DDGG, the SCDE, and the EA. In the event of a breach, forget how it comes in for a minute, and it does happen. Hopefully it never does, of course. Mm-hmm. How does that work in terms of who, and I'm going to ask the really horrible question, who's liable, district, state, EA, right? Who's covering that, and who's responsible for the communication plan? I don't know what that is. It appears it's not the DDGG. I am perfectly happy with that, to be honest. And I'm to defer to Dan and the SCDE's IT security team, which is great news. I was glad to hear most of that yesterday. But what does that look like? Just curious.
Yes, so I'll just respond from like a manager of the tech side of this. The thing that would happen if there was a breach identified or evidence of a breach, we would do a whole cloth. I think the first thing that we would do like right away is just kind of turn off everything and turn off all the keys and secrets, so that we could identify what was the method of breach, right? Is it a attack on one of the components that you're seeing on the screen here? Is it a compromise of a key and secret? So that then we could determine like the scope of the breach, and we would offer up any information on that front. The other questions that you asked, it's above my pay grade. But just in terms of the tech response, you know, our responsibility on the management of this, like the AWS side of things, we would remove access. We would scale back accessibility to the system, identify the breach pattern, and then communicate that out to all the relevant parties, including DDGG, if it's a particular district, SEDE, and then, you know, then go through the next steps of amelioration. In terms of like the cost and stuff of that, I'll let Andrew answer those parts of the question. I'm just a tech guy.
The triage part sounds good. I guess
Yeah,
that's
it's-
part of
And
it.
you're talking about the incident, that was really covering more of the incident response portion. But if there was a breach, we would follow our internal breach policies, which are really what South Carolina government requires us to do. And that would be handled after we determined there was either a breach or a disclosure of information. It depends on which one. We would work with the privacy office, the general counsel, and the communication office staff, and they would handle communicating that breach if necessary, and certainly if there was a disclosure of information that would be passed on based on that process.
Okay.
And then practically from like a legal perspective,
Yeah.
you know, we have a contractual EA. This has a contractual relationship with South Carolina. However, that does not shield us from liability in case we're always liable at some level. And so that's a very, very important thing for us. And we'd love to talk more about what that would, you know, look like.
Yeah, no, that's just my curiosity, because I just, you know, from a DDGG perspective, I'm trying to understand that. I don't believe we have any liability, but I don't want to assume that because it's not really crystal clear, but that's fine.
You don't currently, however,
Right.
as the DDGG does more cool stuff that the state doesn't have any say over, or what I don't exactly know how that governance will work. I guess that's what this body is trying to figure out, but
Yes.
it may change. And so that the legal thing here gets really complicated really quickly, but depending on the use case, the liability can shift.
Mhm. But for right
So-
now, we're good.
Right. So like if a district had a key secret and they just like published it on the internet and didn't tell anyone, and someone went and got all their data,
That's the difference.
that would be on the district.
Absolutely. Okay. No, I just wanted to ask how that relationship worked, but you guys, you know, you guys answered the triage question really quick, and Al chimed in, so I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions, you know, based on my prior experience, and then as I learn more and more about your deployments here, I'm excited to work with you all. It's an extension of the work that I've been doing for the past 5 years, but on a little bit more for grander scale, and the coordination with the state entity is like a huge part of this project. And so, however I can furnish answers to you all as the DDGG, or if it's individual districts, or you know, whatever combinations, I'm happy to help and share whatever I've learned. Made tons of mistakes over the years, and you know, I hope to help you all avoid any of those pitfalls, and then blaze new paths, right? So feel free to use me as a resource, and I'm happy to help in any way that I can. If you want to do technical deep dives, I'm always game for that. So.
And okay, I got one more question. Sorry. Were all of this infrastructure with Elastic Beanstalk and your firewall and your load balancer, can you explain real quickly, you know, hopefully maybe Andrew, what was the timeline between the admin app exposure and all of this being created, in terms of did the claim sets, key and secrets exist before the firewall and everything was put in place, or not? I'm just curious.
So the only thing that was this was all infrastructure that was in place from the very start of the project. So
It was just a matter of the admin app having exposure, but you had the IAM access rules and secrets manager in place already?
correct, that's right.
Good.
Yeah, the only
Okay.
thing was that this admin app like this rule to come in here was previously scoped to like the full internet. And then now it's just a little bit more tightly scoped to just EA IPs. But that's part of like previously the EdFi guidance had been make admin app open, on the internet, because you want to be wherever you want and then log in and create a key and secret from wherever you want. But then more recently, they've changed that guidance to say, well, for an on-prem deployment, you want to put the admin app on a private IP. And so the extension of that for a cloud deployment is that you would put it behind, IP rules that are tightly scoped and only allow certain users in. So this is the extension of that, was moving it from accessibility, but it was still not penetrable. It's the same penetration ability either side, but now
No,
it's
you
like behind
scoped it
one
down.
more wall.
Yeah, no, that's good. And then with the API calls, based on where the gateway sits, are we going to be required to have any type of approved list for IP addresses of vendors we bring on or not? And I'm asking this for two reasons. One, I'm just curious, and two, is it something we need to consider in the use case space for the thing that I'm working on for the DDGG, because that might help with network security as well. That's why I'm asking it.
I mean, that's probably, we're talking about with the vendors, because depending on
Yeah.
how the vendor has deployed, we're
Mhm.
actually right in the middle of that right now in my Indiana deployment, is that we have a vendor that a district is working with, that wants to have access to the data center. And we're trying to negotiate what that looks like. That's a lot more complicated for us to do on-prem there than for here, where we would need to talk with that vendor, figure out if it's an IP range, to be assigned them a particular user,
Okay, so
etc.
you are looking at IP ranges for vendors now.
Yeah, maybe if it's appropriate, but our ethos is that the API only allows traffic in with a particular key and secret, and so that should be the limit, because we want maximum usability out of the API surface, and to restrict it to certain IPs would be, not in the same spirit of what we're looking for, especially if districts want to engage with vendors,
Well,
on
yeah,
their
that's
own
what I'm asking.
time, to have to negotiate like a particular pathway in for every vendor would maybe dissuade some vendors from engaging. So that's just it's a philosophical argument more than a technical. You could go both ways technically, but I
I'm
think
gonna
that's like
leave.
fertile ground for you guys as a group to think about how you want to handle that.
Well, in terms of the security and the risk, since it's your liability, I'm perfectly fine with you guys having a preference on it. I was just curious in terms of what will it look like procedurally from the DDGG perspective, and is this part of the use case that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about the request that I've received? Because maybe part of creating a vendor profile with an expiration date also includes adding an IP range. Again, things to discuss. I was just curious if it's still open in terms of the API gateway, or if we do need to start talking about a process to bring them in and add IP ranges for new vendors or not. And it sounds like right now it's no, yes? Correct?
So right now, if I understood what the question, there's no IP restriction for the secure sort of application API. You can for sure do that. I think that's like Rosh said, that would be up to this team about how you want to think about that. That would be not just to put this out there again. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Really, I think everyone can make these decisions, but that would be probably not probably. EdFi would probably say that this should be open, and this is simply from the.
I agree. I was just curious about what you currently have in place.
Yeah. So basically, as we all know, I think that I see some other software developers on here. Everything's possible. It's just a question of the security usability trade-off.
Okay. Right. So I don't have to come up with a process of getting new vendors' IP ranges, right? So please say no.
I mean, if you wanted to.
No, I don't. No, I don't. I want to be clear. I don't. I'm all for security.
No,
but
it's not a requirement right now, but
okay,
it is an option if you you have the option if you'd like in the future. I would strongly recommend in my position that you wouldn't.
Right.
We could put more controls on the other portions of things, but for the API surface,
I'm good with that. I was curious if that was even a train of thought, and if it is, then we need to discuss it. If not, I'm happy with it right now. So thank you.
And I'll share this link with Dan, and then Dan, if you want to distribute it to DDGG, this this is open information, and then there's additional resources, a couple links at the end of the slide, if you want to get to the tech docs EdFi documentation that goes into more detail on these.
Well, I'd have to ask Brian to plug his ears because I doubt you've made that accessible for us to publish. But I think I could find a way to get it out to DDGG if they wanted it.
You should be able to share that link that I sent to. Oh no, did I only put that on Slack? Okay, well I'll get it to you, Dan. I'll get you a link that's shareable.
Fair enough. Thank you. Well, guys, this has been. I have a low-grade headache, but I feel like I've learned a lot. So Rosh, Andrew, thank you for taking the time to put this together. I don't want to end discussion before people are ready, but does anybody have any further questions, or maybe just need to think about it a while before you can form the question? And I will be happy either to share Rosh's email address with his blessings or relay information to him.
Yeah, no, sure. You're free to send my email out. I'm happy to answer questions.
Then I'm going to call this meeting, this presentation officially over and move to my next meeting.
Thank you. It was good.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.